You want to know who the top scoring quarterback is going to be for 2023 fantasy season? We can't guarantee to tell you who it is, but these are the players, the only players that have a shot. Let's start with the front runners. Guys, you already know are going to be the first quarterbacks taken in fantasy drafts. I think we need to start with Mr. Patrick Mahomes. Pretty clearly the best quarterback in the NFL, but is he going to be the best fantasy quarterback this year with his group of receivers?
Yeah, I don't even know if it matters who his group of receivers are, honestly. I think if you and I were his group of receivers, he still could be the QB1. I mean, obviously he has a chance to be the QB1 every year he's out there and he stays healthy. Even though he doesn't give you tremendous rushing upside like the other quarterbacks we're going to talk about here, it doesn't matter because he's always a threat to throw for 5,000 yards and 40-plus touchdowns every year. So Patrick Mahomes definitely has a case to be the number one quarterback.
Yeah, it's funny because it really doesn't matter who's out there. And you hear stuff in the preseason like, this group of receivers actually looks pretty good. Guess why they look pretty good? They weren't good before they got to Kansas City. I mean, they were probably good, but not that great. Look, it doesn't matter. Mahomes always has a path. I'm not sold that it's a slam dunk that he's the top fantasy quarterback because there are QBs, like you said, with higher rushing upside. Things happen, but I'd say he's a pretty good lock to be at least a top 3 fantasy quarterback. But here's the thing. Josh Allen, we've seen finish as the QB1 in back-to-back seasons, just not last season. So does he go back to his previous elite status, or do you think there's trouble? All these rumors of Stephon Diggs isn't happy, and maybe the new offensive coordinator, things are different without Dayball. What are you believing?
I believe he still can because of what he can do with his legs and his rushing ability, especially near the goal line. He's a huge quarterback, so you don't have to worry about him taking hits. He can be near the goal line and just truck people, score touchdowns. Also, he was playing very well last year before that elbow injury. I wonder if that kind of affected his numbers down the stretch. He's not my favorite to say he's going to be the QB1 this year. I think he'll still be really good. He still has a chance. He definitely could do it. Not my favorite, but the potential is there.
Well, I'm going to stick with what I've been saying. I don't think he is still that guy from a couple years ago. I think, sure, maybe top 5. I mean, that seems like a pretty safe bet. I'm not drafting him as a top 5 quarterback, which doesn't mean I think it's impossible he finishes a top 5 quarterback. But my point is, I don't see him as the QB1 anymore. I think there's just some guys who are passing him up. And one of those guys definitely could be Jalen Hurts, who looked like he was on track to be the top quarterback last year until he had to miss a couple of games. Is this the year where he maybe takes the throne?
It definitely could be. I mean, he was going to be one of the top scoring quarterbacks, not only of last year, but of all time. I mean, he was breaking fantasy football last year. And there's no reason to think it'll change because if you look at last year, they didn't have to throw the ball a lot. Every game, they were just way up in the fourth quarter and they would just stop throwing the ball. I think the defense is going to be a little worse this year. They're not going to be like a bottom 5 defense like Minnesota, but they're going to be a little bit worse. I think that means they're going to have to throw a little bit more. They're going to actually have to compete later into games. They're not going to be in the fourth quarter with the game already wrapped up. So Jalen Hurts could actually be better. We know he has the weapons around him. Devonta Smith, A.J. Brown, Dallas Goedert. We know the rushing. We know the goal line carries. Definitely has a clear path to the QB1.
Yeah, I mean, I'm taking him for sure as a top 3 quarterback. I think he's got just as good a chance as a guy like Mahomes to be the quarterback 1. Like I said, could have been him last year. I don't worry about the defense too much because, man, their draft, they came out with a haul, a couple of stud rookies on the defensive side and Carter and Dean. But I do worry that, number one, a little bit of Super Bowl hangover. That always happens maybe, but also a tougher schedule. Other teams are going to be gunning for him a little bit more, a little more of a known commodity. Maybe some people weren't ready for last year's version of Jalen Hurts. They'll be ready this year. But still, I mean, he's got everything you're looking for. So, I mean, between him and Mahomes, either way. But we have some contenders who also have a good chance. Well, how about a guy who has been the quarterback 1 in the past as well? Lamar Jackson. We've talked a ton about Baltimore this offseason. New OC, some new receivers. Is that all he needed?
Well, I'm not going to say it's all he needed because he's done it before, but it may be all he needed to get back to that because this offense is going to be so different. It's going to utilize his strengths more. let him throw the ball more, still allow him to run when he needs to. Also, it's going to play much faster, and that's an important thing. The more snaps an offense has, the more times guys get to touch the ball, the more fantasy points they can get. So this is going to be a very fantasy-friendly offense. We know what he can do with his legs. We know he's a more than capable passer. He has weapons. Another guy who definitely has a case as a top-scoring QB this year.
I think there's a great chance he finishes as the top-scoring QB. And I'll tell you, you don't have to draft him as the number one QB. Those three guys we already talked about, usually drafted first. I will wait around a few picks, whatever it is, and I'll draft Lamar instead. I think Lamar is going to finish ahead of Josh Allen, and I'm going to draft that way accordingly. But then just to make things more complicated, here's a guy who could just ruin everything and finish ahead of everybody in the field. That's Justin Fields. I know that for you, he's a must-have player. I mean, is he really going to leapfrog all these guys we discussed?
I mean, he could. He did it last year over that stretch from week 6 to week 13 or whatever it was. Wasn't he the QB1 in all of fantasy? And he wasn't even throwing the ball. He was giving you nothing through the air. He was just ripping off 60-yard touchdown runs like it was no big deal at all. This guy is pretty much a lock for 1,000 rushing yards and 6+ rushing touchdowns, assuming he stays healthy. And I think he throws enough this year. Remember, Jalen Hurts doesn't throw for 4,000+ yards. He gets 3,500 yards. That's enough. Mid-20 touchdowns. That's enough. I think Justin Fields could make a leap similar to what we saw with Jalen Hurts last year. Definitely another guy I think has the potential to be the number one QB this year.
It's hard to argue against it. And some people just don't want to believe in Justin Fields, that he's capable of passing. I think we heard that before with Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts. So I'm not worried about that, his ability to improve. And he got a pretty good addition to his receiving core in DJ Moore. So the question for me is not whether he can show enough improvement, whether he can put up those kind of stats. It's just a matter of whether he can reach the same heights as those guys consistently. But you know what? If I'm going to draft a quarterback early, this is the range where I want to draft the Lamars and the Justin Fields, who have that chance to finish as a top 2-3 quarterback, but you don't have to draft them that way. We have a couple more quarterbacks to discuss, but first, some news from one of our partners.
Introducing DraftLane, the ultimate app for every fantasy football enthusiast. Take a trip down memory lane with our unique league history feature, giving you a comprehensive view of all your past leagues. Challenge yourself by comparing your historical performance against your league mates. Climb up the ranks and strive for the top spot in the DraftLane rankings. Connect directly with Pierre and myself to receive answers to all your burning fantasy questions. Experience the ultimate draft companion. We can tell you exactly who to pick when you're on the clock to help you draft that winning roster. During the season, rely on DraftLane to help you set winning lineups, make strategic waiver pickups, and even get personalized trade advice all through our user-friendly app. Download DraftLane for free on the App Store or Google Play for Android phones today.
There's always a quarterback who comes from the mid-round range and jumps up to elite status. QB1 overall? Maybe. Well, why don't we start with a guy who's known as elite quarterback? Is he that for fantasy? I'm talking about Joe Burrow. Do you think Burrow has what it takes? Does he have, the rushing upside to even compete?
Yeah, that's the thing here. He doesn't rush for a ton of yards. He kind of sneaky rushes a little bit. He'll get sneaks around the goal line, which is nice. But he doesn't rush for the kind of yardage that Lamar or Fields or Hurts or those guys are going to rush for. And I don't see him putting up the kind of numbers Patrick Mahomes does. I do think he puts up great numbers this year. If Chase can stay healthy and Higgins can stay healthy all year, this offense could certainly be prolific. But QB1 for a guy like Joe Burrow, who doesn't give you that massive rushing upside, just seems like a stretch. But I do think he has another top 5 season in him.
The more I really think about it and, break down the way he plays and everything, I might get some hate for this, but I'm just saying, I think in fantasy, might be a little overrated. Just saying. I think he's a solid quarterback, obviously going to have some boom games in him. Just doesn't have the ceiling of any of the guys we've talked about. And really, I don't think of some of the guys we're about to talk about. So far from my favorite to be an elite fantasy quarterback. Now, how about another guy who has been an elite quarterback? At one point had the most passing yards in the league, but it seems like a long time ago since Deshaun Watson was at that level. Didn't look good last year. We're big on him, but how big?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm ready to say QB1 big. he certainly has the weapons. Amari Cooper, Elijah Moore, Peoples-Jones. I will say another thing. He does run, I think, a bit more than people expect him to or think he does, and I think we will see that this year. But, man, QB1 feels like the absolute upper range of his ceiling. Again, another guy I think could be top 5, definitely top 10. QB1 feels like a stretch.
Yeah, I mean, I love drafting him where you can get him, but yeah, I'm not going to expect QB1 type of numbers. But one thing you have to realize, and why I like him better than a guy like Burrow, like you said, he will run the ball. He's an effective runner. He's not a guy who's an obvious rushing threat. He'll only run if he needs to, but he's an effective scrambler. He can get chunk yardage, and he'll take it in near the goal line. So I do think that Watson has a shot to be one of the better fantasy QBs. But yeah, I'm not going so far as to say that he's really got a legit shot to be the top fantasy quarterback. All right. We both like Trevor Lawrence to take another step forward this year. Great value in drafts. I mean, what is his actual ceiling this year? Is it that of the top quarterback? He was drafted as a top quarterback his year. I mean, do you think that he can be that generational type of prospect?
I mean, he can be that type of generational prospect, but in fantasy, because he kind of runs like about the same amount Patrick Mahomes does. Like, he'll sneakily get you some rushing yards. He'll sneak around the goal line, which Mahomes really doesn't do that too much. But, man, he needs to throw, like, prolific passing numbers. I think we see a big improvement for him. I've talked about it. I think we see, like, 4,500 yards, mid-30 touchdowns, but that's not enough for QB1. I think his ceiling is like a top 5 quarterback. I think he'll be great this year. But, again, QB1, that feels like too far of a stretch.
Well, I said this a lot last year. Before I really buy into Lawrence, I need to see him run more because he did that more in college. Just wasn't used enough as a runner last year. Not even 300 yards on the ground. He's a big guy. He'll get some quarterback sneaks and things like that, get a few touchdowns. But so will all these other guys we talked about pretty much. And yeah, unless he really becomes a dual threat quarterback, which I don't see happening in this system. And they have 2 good running backs now. So yeah, Lawrence, great value in drafts, but yeah, I don't see it happening for him. And then what do you make of Justin Herbert? Got to mention him. One of the most talented quarterbacks. Also a guy who's good on his feet. You know, he should take another step forward with a new offensive coordinator. But what do you think he's going to actually produce?
I think this is going to be the best season we've ever seen from Justin Herbert. I think he's going to have the most yards, most touchdowns he's ever had. But this guy is pretty much a statue. I mean, he hardly runs at all. He needs to put up like almost record-breaking type of numbers if he's going to be the QB1, or he's going to need a bunch of quarterbacks to get hurt this year. So I love Justin Herbert. I think he's going to have a massive year this year, the best year he's ever had. But man, QB1 feels like way, way too far out of his range.
Well, I'll agree, and I'll just say there's a lesson here. It's, you know what, real life versus fantasy. There's a difference. I think in quarterback, it's the biggest difference out of any position because completion percentage, it's not really used that often as a stat in fantasy leagues. You don't really have to care how effective a passer somebody is. You care about fantasy points, and these days, you get that on the ground more easily than you do through the air. Of course, you want a guy who do both, and we have those type of guys in Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, potentially Lamar Jackson again this year, Justin Fields. These guys that are dark horses, it's for a reason, and it's rare that a quarterback jumps up to be the top quarterback out of nowhere. We got some candidates, guys that we've already mentioned, but you have to have that dual threat ability. And yeah, Herbert, Burrow, those guys just don't have it. Now you know who could be the QB1? Who might be the RB1 overall this year? We'll break that down for you as well. Check out this video.